The waves crashed relentlessly against the jagged cliffs, their haunting rhythm a siren call echoing across the desolate coastline. The lighthouse stood as a solitary sentinel, its towering frame cloaked in shadow under the overcast sky. For decades, it had been a beacon of safety, guiding lost sailors through treacherous waters. But now, it was silent, a grim relic of forgotten times. Elliot Graves arrived with a single suitcase and an air of unease. He had always been drawn to the isolation of the sea, but this assignment felt different. The previous keeper had vanished without a trace 6 months ago, leaving behind only cryptic journal entries and rumors whispered by superstitious villagers. They spoke of strange lights in the fog and voices carried on the wind. Elliot was a pragmatic man, a believer in logic over folklore. The pay was generous, and the lighthouse needed tending. It was as simple as that, or so he told himself. The villagers had avoided him as he boarded the rickety boat to the island. Even the grizzled ferryman who rowed him across said little, his sunken eyes darting toward the lighthouse as though it might spring to life. "Keep your wits about you, lad," the old man muttered as they docked. Elliot nodded, but the words lingered. The lighthouse interior was cold and unwelcoming, its spiral staircase creaking with every step. Dust clung to every surface, and the air smelled faintly of salt and decay. He set his suitcase down in the small living quarters, the only sound his own breath and the occasional groan of the wind. On the desk lay a leather-bound journal, its pages worn and stained. It had belonged to the previous keeper, a man named Samuel Whitlock. Curious, Elliot opened it. The first few entries were mundane. Notes about weather conditions, maintenance schedules, and supply inventories. But as he flipped through, the tone shifted. July 17th. The light went out for 2 hours tonight. No explanation. I checked the mechanisms. Everything seemed in working order. But the silence outside, it wasn't natural. I swear I heard someone whisper my name. August 2nd. Something is wrong here. The fog doesn't feel like fog. It moves almost like it's alive. I hear footsteps at night, but when I check, there's no one there. August 28th? If anyone reads this, know that I tried to leave. The boat, it was gone. The tide doesn't obey the moon here. I'm not alone. I know it now. The final entry was smeared, the ink bleeding as though written in haste. The only legible words were, "The light must stay on. Always." Elliot closed the journal, his heart pounding. A chill crept through the room, though the wind had stilled outside. Nightfall came quickly, bringing with it a suffocating darkness. Elliot climbed the staircase to the lantern room, its massive glass panes offering a panoramic view of the turbulent sea. The machinery groaned as he cranked it to life, the beam of light slicing through the night. But as the light swept over the waters, Elliot thought he saw something, a shadow too large to be a wave. It disappeared before he could focus on it, leaving him questioning his own senses. He stayed in the lantern room for hours, watching the beam rotate, his mind replaying Samuel's final entry. Around midnight, the fog rolled in. It wasn't the gradual drift he had expected, but a sudden, almost sentient surge that swallowed the island whole. The lighthouse seemed to groan under its weight, the walls trembling as if in protest. Then, the first sound came, a faint tapping at the door far below. Elliot froze. No one else was supposed to be on the island. He descended cautiously, each step of the spiral staircase amplifying the dread in his chest. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice trembling. No answer. At the base of the lighthouse, he hesitated before unbolting the heavy door. The wind pushed it open, revealing nothing but thick fog. The tapping stopped, but as he turned to close the door, he saw them. Footprints in the damp earth, leading away into the mist. Elliot's breath quickened as he followed the tracks, his lantern casting long shadows that danced eerily on the ground. The footprints led to the edge of the cliff, where they stopped abruptly. He peered over the edge, the crashing waves far below barely visible through the fog. Just as he turned to head back, a whisper brushed past his ear. "Leave Elliot spun around, his lantern swinging wildly. The fog seemed to close in tighter, shapes forming and dissipating at the edges of his vision. He stumbled back to the lighthouse, bolting the door behind him. The rest of the night passed in tense silence. Elliot remained in the lantern room, clutching the journal as though it might offer protection. But the whispers didn't return, and by dawn, the fog had lifted. The sunlight offered little comfort as he surveyed the island. The footprints were gone, as though they had never been there. Elliot resolved to write it off as exhaustion or a trick of the mind. But deep down, he knew better. The light must stay on, always. And somewhere in the depths of the ocean, something stirred. The days blurred into an uneasy rhythm for Elliot. The routine of maintaining the lighthouse offered little solace. The mechanical grind of the light's rotation became his constant companion, a fragile reassurance against the silence that pressed in from all sides. Yet every night brought new unease. The fog returned with a vengeance, thicker and more oppressive than before. Elliot began to notice peculiar patterns in its movement, as though it recoiled from the beam of the light, yet lingered at its edges, waiting. During the day, he explored the rocky island, searching for answers or even a sense of normalcy. But the landscape offered only desolation. The journal became his obsession. He read and reread Samuel Whitlock's entries, hoping to find some clue, some explanation. One entry stood out more than the others. September 3rd, I heard it again last night. Not just whispers this time, a voice, low and guttural, calling from the rocks. It knows my name. I must keep the light on. Without it, they come closer. Elliot's rational mind struggled to make sense of what he had read. He told himself it was simply the ramblings of a man succumbing to isolation and fear. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that Whitlock hadn't been imagining things. The unease became harder to dismiss when, one evening, he noticed something strange. The lantern room was meticulously clean when he left it every morning. Yet by the time he returned at dusk, the glass was smeared with what looked like handprints. At first, he thought they were his own, a careless oversight. But the size of the prints was unsettling. They were larger than any human hand he had ever seen, with elongated fingers that seemed almost claw-like. One night, as Elliot sat in the lantern room, staring out at the endless expanse of water, he heard it, a low, melodic hum rising from the fog. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it sent a shiver down his spine. He leaned closer to the glass, trying to pinpoint the source. The light swept across the waves, and for a fleeting moment, he saw it again, a shadow, massive and unnatural, just beneath the surface. It moved with a slow, deliberate grace before vanishing into the depths. Elliot recoiled, his heart pounding. He told himself it was just a whale or some other sea creature, but the rationalization felt hollow. He descended the spiral staircase, his footsteps echoing in the oppressive silence. The hum followed him, growing louder as though it was inside his head. He bolted the door to the living quarters, feeling a childish need for barriers, and tried to focus on something, anything other than the sound. But then came the knocking. It was subtle at first, a light tap, tap, tap that seemed to come from the very walls. Elliot froze, his breath hitching. The knocking grew louder, more insistent, and then shifted. Now it was coming from the ceiling. He grabbed the lantern and climbed back to the lantern room, dread coiling in his stomach. The knocking ceased as abruptly as it had started, leaving only silence in its wake. But then he saw it. Etched into the condensation on the glass was a single word. Leave. Elliot stumbled backward, nearly dropping the lantern. The word glistened as if freshly drawn, the letters jagged and uneven. He wiped at the glass with his sleeve, his hands trembling. But no matter how hard he scrubbed, the word refused to vanish. That night, sleep eluded him. He lay on the small cot in his quarters, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing. The journal sat on the nightstand, a silent reminder of Samuel's warnings. Every creak of the lighthouse, every gust of wind, felt amplified in the darkness. At some point, exhaustion overtook him, and he drifted into a fitful sleep. He dreamed of the ocean, its waves turning black and thick as oil. Something immense moved beneath the surface, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark. In his dream, he stood at the edge of the cliff, and a voice, low and resonant, whispered his name. Elliot. He woke with a start, his heart hammering. The first light of dawn seeped through the windows, but the air felt heavier than before. As he got up to begin his routine, he noticed something odd. His boots, which he had left by the door, were damp and caked with sand. He hadn't been outside since the previous afternoon. Unease gnawed at him as he climbed the staircase to the lantern room. When he reached the top, he froze. The light had gone out. The machinery, which had been in perfect working order the day before, was silent. The glass panes of the lantern room were cracked, faint traces of salt water dripping down their surface. He worked frantically to repair the light, his mind racing with thoughts of the journal and the warnings it contained. As he cranked the mechanism back to life, the beam pierced through the lingering fog, and he exhaled in relief. But as the light swept across the sea, it illuminated something that made his blood run cold. Standing on the rocks below was a figure, its silhouette stark against the pale mist. It was tall and unnaturally thin, its limbs elongated in a way that defied human proportions. It didn't move, didn't flinch as the beam of light passed over it. Elliot's hands tightened around the crank, his breath caught in his throat. The figure stood motionless, its head tilted slightly as if observing him. And then, as the light swept back, it was gone. He staggered back from the window, his pulse racing. He wanted to believe it was a trick of the fog, a figment of his overworked mind. But deep down, he knew better. By the time night fell again, Elliot was a man on edge, his nerves frayed. He sat in the lantern room, the journal clutched in his hands, waiting for the next sign of the unknown. The silence of the island felt suffocating, and the fog seemed thicker than ever, pressing against the lighthouse like a living thing. When the knocking returned, it wasn't subtle. It came in heavy, deliberate thuds that reverberated through the structure. Elliot gripped the journal tighter, his breath shallow. The thuds grew louder, closer, until they seemed to emanate from just outside the lantern room. And then they stopped. Elliot stood frozen, every muscle in his body tense. Slowly, he turned toward the staircase, half expecting to see the elongated figure climbing toward him. But the staircase was empty. And then, from the fog outside, came the voice. Elliot, Elliot. The voice was low and resonant, as if rising from the depths of the ocean itself. It sent a cold shock through him, freezing him in place. The fog outside the lantern room's windows pulsed faintly, like a living, breathing entity. He clenched the edges of the journal, forcing himself to move. The rational part of his mind screamed for him to turn on the radio and call for help. The lighthouse was equipped with a short-wave transmitter, though he hadn't used it since arriving. Now it felt like his only link to the outside world. Descending the spiral staircase, Elliot felt the weight of the silence around him, as though the air itself were pressing down. Reaching the equipment room, he fumbled with the transmitter, his shaking hands struggling to tune the frequency. "This is the keeper of Ironclad Point Lighthouse," he said into the microphone, his voice breaking slightly. "If anyone can hear me, I need assistance. I repeat, I need assistance immediately." Static crackled in response. He adjusted the dials, trying again, but the static persisted. Then, through the interference, he heard it, a faint voice, distorted and warped. "The light, don't out." The signal cut off abruptly, leaving Elliot staring at the transmitter in stunned silence. The voice had sounded familiar, but he couldn't place it. Before he could try again, a loud crash echoed from upstairs. He bolted back up the staircase, his pulse hammering. Reaching the lantern room, he found the glass panes shattered completely, the cold wind whipping through. The light had gone out again, leaving the room bathed in darkness. Something moved in the corner. Elliot's lantern flickered, casting fleeting shadows across the room. In the brief moments of light, he saw it. A figure hunched and misshapen, its limbs too long, its head craned unnaturally. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, with a texture like seaweed stretched taut. It turned toward him, its face obscured by the shadows, but he felt its gaze pierce through him. A guttural sound emanated from its throat, a mix of a growl and a whisper. "Keeper, you cannot leave." Elliot stumbled back, his lantern falling and extinguishing. Darkness engulfed the room. He fumbled for the staircase, his legs trembling as he descended blindly. He could hear it following, the scraping of its limbs against the metal steps, growing louder with each passing second. Reaching the bottom, he slammed the living quarters door shut and bolted it, his chest heaving. The scraping stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse. The journal lay open on the table where he had left it, the pages fluttering as though stirred by an unseen wind. The final entry had changed. The smeared ink now formed clear words. "The light is a barrier. Keep it burning, or they will come." Elliot's mind raced. The light wasn't just a beacon for ships. It was a ward, a fragile barrier holding back something far worse than fog or storms. But what were they? He spent the rest of the day repairing the lantern. His hands moved mechanically, his thoughts consumed by the figure he had seen and the voice he had heard. By the time night fell, the light was operational again, its beam cutting through the returning fog. He stayed in the lantern room, unwilling to descend. Every hour that passed felt like an eternity, the fog growing denser, more alive. The light swept across the sea, but this time, it illuminated more than shadows. Figures began to emerge from the fog, their distorted forms flickering in and out of existence. They moved slowly, deliberately, their elongated limbs dragging across the rocks below. Elliot's throat tightened as he watched them gather at the base of the lighthouse, their heads tilting upward in unison. They didn't attempt to enter, but instead stood there, swaying slightly, their murmurs barely audible over the sound of the waves. And then, the knocking began again. This time it came from every direction, doors, walls, even the windows of the lantern room. The noise grew louder, more frantic, until it felt as though the lighthouse itself might collapse under the strain. "Keeper," the voices called, overlapping and echoing. "Join us, the sea awaits." Elliot clutched the journal to his chest, his mind teetering on the edge of panic. The light continued its rotation, the only thing keeping the figures at bay. He realized now that Whitlock's warnings weren't just the ramblings of a paranoid man. They were instructions for survival. But then the lantern flickered. "No," Elliot whispered, rushing to the machinery. He cranked the lever desperately, but the mechanism groaned in protest. The light dimmed, the room plunging into near darkness. The knocking stopped. Elliot's breathing was ragged as he turned toward the windows. The fog had pressed in closer, thick and pulsating. The figures were no longer at the base of the lighthouse. They were inside. He could hear them moving through the lower levels, their limbs dragging across the floor, their whispers filling the air. "Keeper, your time is done." The lantern flared briefly before going out entirely. Elliot was left in complete darkness, the fog seeping through the shattered windows like a living thing. He backed into the corner of the room, clutching the journal like a talisman. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as the figures ascended the staircase. In the final moments, as the door to the lantern room creaked open, Elliot understood the truth. The light wasn't just a barrier, it was a warning. The sea had always held secrets, and some were never meant to be uncovered. The fog closed in, and Elliot's scream was swallowed by the silence. The silence was deafening. The last sound Elliot remembered was the door to the lantern room creaking open, followed by an all-encompassing darkness. Yet, when he opened his eyes, he found himself lying at the base of a lighthouse. The fog was gone. The sky above was a strange, overcast gray, but there was no sign of the figures, no sound of their whispers. Elliot sat up slowly, his body aching as though he had been crushed by an unseen force. The lighthouse loomed over him, its light eerily still. As he stood, he noticed something odd. The rocky terrain at the base of the lighthouse looked different. The jagged edges were smoother, almost polished, as though worn down by centuries of relentless tides. The air smelled of salt and decay, and an unnatural chill hung over the island. Elliot staggered inside, his steps echoing in the hollow silence. The interior of the lighthouse was unrecognizable. The walls were damp and coated with a black, oily residue that dripped slowly to the floor. The spiral staircase seemed to stretch endlessly upward, its metal rusted and pitted. His gaze fell on a wooden chest that hadn't been there before, sitting in the center of the room. It looked ancient, its surface warped and discolored. The journal he had clung to was gone, replaced by this ominous relic. With trembling hands, Elliot approached the chest. Something about it drew him in, a pull he couldn't resist. He hesitated for a moment before opening the lid. Inside was a collection of artifacts, faded photographs, a brass compass tarnished with age, and a bundle of letters tied together with fraying twine. Beneath them lay another journal, its cover marked with the same initials, SW. Elliot's breath hitched. This wasn't the journal he had been reading. It was older, the pages yellowed and brittle. He flipped through, finding the entries far more detailed, far more disturbing. August 15th. The sea is alive. I hear its whispers even when the waves are calm. It speaks of hunger, of longing. The light is failing. I can feel them watching. September 1st. They are not of this world. They come from the depths where the sun cannot reach. The light burns them, but only barely. If it fails, they will take us. They will drag us to where the others have gone. Elliot's hands trembled as he turned the pages, the sense of dread growing with every word. The final entry chilled him to his core. September 8th. I am the last. The light grows weaker each night, and their whispers grow louder. They have taken the others. They call to me now. I know my fate is sealed, but I will fight until the light dies. To the next keeper, beware the fog, beware the light, and never, ever listen to their voices. Elliot snapped the journal shut, his mind racing. Whitlock hadn't been the first. The lighthouse had a long history of keepers disappearing, their stories erased from official records. He had stumbled into a legacy of horror, each keeper lured into a cycle they couldn't escape. The letters in the chest confirmed his fears. Each one was from a previous keeper, their words echoing the same terror. They spoke of figures in the fog, of the light as their only defense, and of the sea's insatiable hunger. Why me? Elliot whispered, his voice trembling. As if in answer, the fog began to seep into the lighthouse once more, curling around his feet like living tendrils. The air grew colder, and the faint hum returned, rising from the depths. Keeper. The voice was familiar now, low and guttural, a resonance that seemed to vibrate through his very bones. Elliot backed away from the chest, his heart racing. The fog coalesced into a form, rising from the ground to take shape. It was Samuel Whitlock, or what was left of him. The figure's face was gaunt, its eyes hollow and glowing faintly. Its body seemed to ripple, as though it were only partially solid, caught between worlds. You cannot leave, Whitlock said, his voice a haunting echo. The sea has claimed you, as it claimed me. No! Elliot shouted, stumbling backward. I didn't ask for this. Whitlock tilted his head, a faint trace of sorrow flickering across his ghostly features. None of us did, but the lighthouse needs a keeper. The light is our only shield against them. Elliot's back hit the wall, his breath coming in shallow gasps. Who are they? What do they want? Whitlock's form flickered, his features distorting. They were here long before us. They are the forgotten, the drowned, the forsaken. The sea is their prison, and the light is the lock. But the lock is failing. The room seemed to shift around Elliot, the walls warping and groaning. He felt the ground beneath him tremble as the fog thickened, consuming everything in its path. You must keep the light burning, Whitlock said, his voice growing fainter. Or they will take you. They will take everything. The apparition dissolved into the fog, leaving Elliot alone once more. The chest had disappeared, and the room returned to its decayed, distorted state. He staggered up the staircase, determined to reach the lantern room. The machinery was rusted and unresponsive, the lens cracked and coated with grime. He worked frantically to repair it, his hands blistering on the cranks and levers. The fog pressed against the windows, the figures within more defined now. Their forms were grotesque, their faces twisted in eternal agony. They clawed at the glass, their whispers rising to a deafening cacophony. Elliot screamed as the light finally sputtered to life, the beam cutting through the fog. The figures recoiled, their forms dissolving into shadow. But the victory felt hollow. The whispers didn't stop. As he collapsed onto the floor of the lantern room, exhausted and broken, he realized the truth. The light wasn't a solution, it was a delay. The sea's hunger was eternal, and the lighthouse could only hold it back for so long. Elliot stared out at the endless expanse of water, knowing that his time as keeper was far from over. The fog would return, the figures would come again, and he would fight until the light failed, just as every keeper before him had. Elliot woke to the sound of waves crashing against the rocks below. The lantern room was eerily quiet, the air thick with an unnatural stillness. The light continued its steady rotation, but its once brilliant beam now seemed dimmer, its strength waning. He glanced at the machinery. Despite his desperate repairs, the gears groaned under the strain, and the lantern flickered faintly. He knew it wouldn't hold for long. The fog was already gathering at the edges of the horizon, creeping back like a predator waiting for its chance. Elliot paced the lantern room, his mind racing. He had read every word in Whitlock's journal and the letters from the previous keepers. Their warnings had been clear. The light was the only thing keeping the horrors of the sea at bay. But no one had explained how to end the curse. "Why does it have to be me?" Elliot muttered. His voice echoed in the empty room. The answer came not from his thoughts, but from the fog. It began to press against the windows again. Faint whispers carried on the wind. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, mocking, taunting, daring him to give in. He slammed his fist on the table, the sound reverberating through the room. "No," he said through gritted teeth. "I'm not going to be another forgotten keeper." His gaze fell on the chest that had reappeared in the corner of the room, its warped wood glinting faintly in the dim light. The journal he had found earlier was gone, replaced by a single sheet of paper resting atop the artifacts. Elliot approached cautiously, his hands trembling as he picked up the paper. The handwriting was familiar. It belonged to Whitlock. The only way to end it is to descend, face them, confront the truth below the waves. The light delays them, but it cannot destroy them. Only you can decide if the cycle continues. Elliot's blood ran cold. Descend? Into the ocean? The thought filled him with dread, but he knew Whitlock wouldn't have written it lightly. He sat on the floor, staring out at the fog-shrouded sea. For a long time he wrestled with the choice. He could stay here, keep the light burning, and live the rest of his life as a prisoner of the lighthouse. Or he could descend into the depths and confront whatever horrors lay beneath. The whispers grew louder, the fog pressing closer, almost suffocating. The figures began to emerge again, their forms more solid, more menacing. Elliot felt the weight of their gazes even through the glass. He made his decision. Grabbing a flashlight and a length of rope, Elliot descended the spiral staircase to the base of the lighthouse. The waves crashed violently against the rocks, the water black and churning. The whispers became a roar as he approached the edge, the sea seeming to call his name. "Keeper, come to us." Taking a deep breath, he tied the rope around his waist and secured it to a rusted metal post. The flashlight flickered as he stepped into the freezing water, each step feeling like a pull into another world. The descent was slow and grueling. The ocean seemed to swallow the light, the beam barely illuminating the swirling darkness around him. Shapes moved just beyond his vision, fleeting glimpses of pale, distorted forms. The pressure increased as he went deeper, his chest tightening with each passing second. The whispers became deafening, surrounding him from all directions. "Elliot," he froze. This time, the voice was different. It wasn't the guttural tone of the figures in the fog. It was familiar, warm. "Elliot, don't be afraid." His heart clenched. It was his father's voice. "Dad," he whispered, his voice muffled by the water. "Yes, son. I've been waiting for you." The beam of his flashlight caught something ahead, a figure standing on the ocean floor, its features blurry but unmistakable. It was his father, or at least it looked like him. "Come closer," the figure said, extending a hand. Elliot hesitated. Something about the voice was wrong, too perfect, too rehearsed. But the sight of his father's face, the one he had lost so many years ago, was almost too much to resist. "You're not him," Elliot said, his voice trembling. The figure smiled, and the illusion shattered. Its face twisted into something monstrous, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. The hand it extended morphed into a claw, reaching for him with inhuman speed. Elliot screamed, dropping the flashlight as he struggled against the creature's grip. The water churned violently, and more figures emerged from the darkness, their forms grotesque and writhing. The rope around his waist tugged, pulling him upward. He clawed at it desperately, trying to escape the grasp of the creatures. The figures howled, their voices blending into a cacophony of rage and despair. As he broke the surface, gasping for air, the fog seemed to recoil. The lighthouse's beam flared brightly for a moment before dimming again. Elliot lay on the rocks, shivering and soaked, his mind racing. He had seen them, the source of the whispers, the beings the lighthouse had kept at bay for generations. But he also understood now. The light wasn't a tool to destroy them. It was a fragile barrier, a temporary reprieve. The curse of the lighthouse would never end, not until someone was willing to sacrifice themselves entirely. Elliot stood, staring up at the towering structure. The light was flickering again, the machinery grinding to a halt. The fog began to return, thicker and darker than before. With resolve in his heart, he climbed the staircase one last time. He knew what he had to do. As the light began to fail, Elliot opened a journal and wrote a single entry. To the next keeper, the sea cannot be conquered. The light is our only hope. If you choose to stay, remember this: you are not alone. But if you choose to descend, know that you face eternity. The fog consumed the lighthouse, and the light went out. Elliot's fate became part of the legend, another forgotten keeper in the endless cycle. And far below the waves, the figures waited, their whispers carrying on the wind, calling for the next.